Okay, here we are for chapter 8, voice leading in two voices. So when we talk about voice leading, we're really talking about how do we put two melodies at the same time, which is what counterpoint is. Counterpoint is the art of putting two pieces of music or two melodies together at the same time, and what are the rules for doing that. So in order to learn the rules, we have to talk about the kinds of motion. So the first kind of motion is parallel motion. Parallel motion, and you can see it a little bit further down here, is where both voices move in the same direction by the same interval. So what's written right there is, so they're both moving up one step, and we see 2/3 together. The second type of motion is oblique motion. And oblique motion is where one voice remains the same while the other voice moves. And a little further over on the page, you can see that. And here's the example. So the bottom voice moved, but the top voice stays the same. Number 3, oh my goodness, there's stars there. Contrary motion, because contrary motion is the voice leading motion. It is the most important kind of motion. If you always move in contrary motion, you will not get in trouble. So contrary motion is when the voices move in opposite directions. So you can see in the first example that the top voice is going to move down and the bottom voice is going to move up, and it sounds like this. Oops. So they've moved in opposite directions. And lastly, similar motion. Both voices are going to move in the same direction, but not by the same interval. And that ends up sounding like this. So they've both moved up, but not at the same interval. Okay, so voice leading. The counterpoint, which we have studied in the last few weeks, is now expanding to voice leading. And the rules are strict and they must be obeyed. So we've been talking about phrases and melody, and now we're talking about how do two melodies go at the same time. So there are these very specific rules, and we're going to learn species 1 counterpoint, which is note against note. There are 5 species. You do that in a sophomore theory class. So in species 1 counterpoint, there are only certain intervals which you will be allowed to write, and those are thirds, perfect fifths, sixths, perfect octaves, and tenths. That's it. So the rules. Number 1, if you go from a perfect interval, meaning a perfect fifth or a perfect octave, to an imperfect interval, meaning a third, a sixth, or 10th, you can do that in similar, contrary, or oblique motion. Number 2, if you're going from imperfect, meaning thirds, sixths, or 10ths, to a perfect interval, perfect fifth, or perfect octaves, you can only go in contrary or oblique motion. That is it, and very important. Okay? Number 3, from imperfect to imperfect, you can do it however you want. That's totally cool. It's when we get the perfect intervals that we have to be very, very careful. Okay? When we go to a perfect interval, you really got to be careful how you get there. You cannot go in similar or parallel. You got to go in opposite directions, or one voice has to stay the same. Please be careful. Here it says at the bottom, oblique motion is static, meaning it does nothing. There's no motion. So it really should be used sparingly, no more than once or twice in any given exercise. Just so I can say it again, parallel fifths or octaves is forbidden. Approaching, if you go to a fifth or an octave, you cannot go in similar motion either. It creates hidden parallelism. That's from rule number 2 in the previous slide. So a couple things you want to keep in mind when you're writing these things. You want to really just be going stepwise. You don't want to leap. If you have to leap, you'll always have to leap, but only do it, don't try not to leap more than 3 times. You're going to rise to a high point and then fall. Try not to leap twice in a row unless they outline a triad. You don't want to leap a 7th or anything that's diminished or augmented. The range of your exercise will be less than a 10th. Try not to repeat figures or sequences. You might end up finding that goes very nicely with the melody that you're given, but you can't write that. Please don't outline a tritone. When you begin an exercise, you're going to do it on a unison, a perfect 5th, or a perfect octave, always. The end of your exercise, you'll be approaching the final by a half step in one voice and a whole step in the other voice. We will do this all together. And when you're in minor, make sure if you're going to have to raise the leading tone, keep it at least 3 measures away from the natural equivalent, from a not raised leading tone. And a few more rules here. Oblique motion, I had already said, try not to do it too much. Really only do it twice in an exercise. Thirds, perfect 5th, 6th, perfect octaves, and 10ths are the only acceptable intervals. If you write anything else, it will be wrong, okay? Parallel 5ths and octaves are forbidden. I think I should say it again. Parallel 5ths and octaves are forbidden. Don't write them, okay? If you're writing in the intervals and you see 5, 5, it's wrong. It's parallel 5ths, okay? Avoid hidden 5ths and octaves, meaning you cannot approach a 5th or an octave in similar motion. If you approach it, if you get into it going in the same direction, it will be hidden, okay? And that's it for chapter 8.